Get ready, everybody, because today we're going to jump back into the transformative world of artificial intelligence. AI, it's so trendy. We've got to talk about AI. We've got to test AI. In earlier episodes, we explored generative large language models. We introduced the Connor bot. He was pretty unforgettable. And we discussed breakthroughs in protein synthesis. And now we're going to take it up a notch with insights from leading experts.
And AI goes far beyond chatbots and stunning visuals. It is reshaping industries as we speak. Industries such as medicine, by refining the development of drug molecules, summarizing patient records and data and generating insights that drive action for clinicians, and addressing really critical challenges in areas such as bias and data quality. So, artificial intelligence, while it's neither artificial nor intelligent, it is what matters in this episode of Discovery Matters, brought to you by the lovely people at Cytiva.
My name is Shweta Maniar. I am responsible for the global life sciences as a strategic industry in healthcare and life sciences in Google Cloud. When I first started in the healthcare industry, I'd never believed 20 years ago that I would be sitting in a tech company. I've worked in such organizations such as Roche and Genentech. How do we think about how does technology play a role? For example, when I was at Genentech 10 plus years ago, thinking about creating mobile medical apps because apps were all the rage in terms of this can help you identify if you need to go see a doctor or can maybe diagnose. I was also looking at how can we improve human health, not just with the medicines or the devices that are being developed, but really holistically, and how does technology play a role in that? So seeing that there was an opportunity for tech to help and change healthcare delivery,
Shweta went from lab work to, there's an app for that, to what is the next big vision?
And why then is Google Cloud concerned with the life sciences?
My personal perspective is tech companies as a whole have started realizing that identifying and bringing people in who can do the work or who have been in the industry are going to be really important and to provide the right level of perspective. I always joke around, my best joke is actually that everybody says, let's disrupt healthcare. Nobody wants to disrupt healthcare. That is a terrible word, right? And so I tell people, like, nobody wants to come in and say that they're going to be disrupted. They want to be helped.
Shweta is based in Silicon Valley, the Northern California epicenter of innovation and disruption. But as human beings, we often find disruptive change overwhelming. Take Google, for example. Tech giant, stepping into healthcare, saying that its expertise in technology can redefine the future of the field. This move raises an important question, though. How do we reconcile the need for change and the disruption it will cause in healthcare, which is notoriously slow-moving and, importantly, a regulated industry?
No matter what tech company, fill in the blank. The technology capabilities are there to help and enhance the healthcare ecosystem. It's an ecosystem. So what I mean by that is that you are looking at the technology can do probably much more than what it's allowed to do right now in the healthcare ecosystem. But it is the requirement of regulatory bodies to create the guardrails, doctors to trust in the system, scientists to leverage and trust in the output of the result. There are many predictive algorithms and models and technologies that can be used to help narrow that funnel so that you have, instead of 1,000, now you have only 100 things to focus on, right? The technology has a lot of capabilities to help, but it's not just about, hey, can tech do this? I always say it's about how do we do this safely? How do we always have a human in the loop? You can be a computer scientist or you could just be a pediatrician or anywhere in between. We all still have a responsibility to understand how the technology works in order to have trust in that system, right? It can't be a black box to say, hey, radiologist, instead of focusing on these 100 images, please focus on these 10 and not these 90. As a radiologist, you need to understand why was the output of that model saying not to focus on those 90, right?
Human in the loop is a core tenet of responsible AI. We will be getting into an episode on this in the coming months, but before we get deep into human in the loop, how can we use AI to help in drug discovery? We've seen advances such as the work that's been done with AlphaFold for protein structure predictions and so on. Number of companies developing drugs based on using artificial intelligence approaches. And the idea that we're able to refine drug candidates is relatively well understood. But from Shweta's perspective, what's the next step that she sees in accelerating those very difficult early years of a potential drug's life into the clinical stages and beyond?
Enter generative AI.
Generative AI, it's not just another tool. It's really a way that we can transform how we develop treatments and how we diagnose treatments. It doesn't just analyze information. A concept of generative AI is that it can actually create things. It's creating new content or text or images or music or code. I think that's where there's an opportunity for us to think about generative AI in developing treatments. What are those use cases in generative AI? Generative AI can analyze a vast amount of data sets, genomic, proteomic, clinical information. You can identify promising targets. You could potentially use generative AI to help with drug design. You can use AI algorithms to generate candidates based on some of the desired properties that you're looking at and optimize maybe existing molecules that exist. Lead optimization. You can use generative AI to potentially predict how different chemical modifications could actually affect drugs properties, and optimizing to accelerate the optimization process.
One example Shweta has worked on is MedGemini.
MedGemini, it's an advanced model for the healthcare field. A very, very intelligent doctor with a lot of medical knowledge, and now you can analyze these complex data sets. So these tools and these models is now looking at, with a variety of partners, looking at how you can analyze X-rays and MRIs and help doctors diagnose or at least triage abnormalities. This is not just about, thinking about looking up a very unique molecule or even something as simple as looking up diabetes and knowing that it's also abbreviated in a variety of different ways, or diabetic macular edema. These models can provide detailed and accurate answers because historically, if you searched your database for diabetes, your search results are going to have only documents or things. And then remember, it's not just about documents. It's images, it's audio, a variety. It's also been used to summarizing medical records, sifting through lengthy medical patient records, summarizing key information with the intent to help those who are the caregivers to save time. Google Cloud has established a handful of partnerships. I think a great one to identify is with Ginkgo Bioworks, where they have used AI to build representations of proteins and DNA across multiple organisms. Coming into 2025, this is when we're going to see the year of headlines talking about how these technologies have not only been implemented in a scalable way, but where you're actually able to also talk more openly about the ROI from these cases, which is so incredibly exciting.
So this is about companies starting to do early stage drug discovery target identification and candidate identification in a different way. The target, remember, is the biology that you want to modulate with your drug, and the candidate is the potential drug that you're working with. And wet work, or lab work as they call it, is very often going to include the same processes in validation of the work that's done in silico or on a computer. But it means that scientists have to think differently about how they structure the use of their data. So what is it that people need to understand as they do their designs of experiments and they start to generate data sets that can then be used as part of generative AI systems to create potential targets or candidates in drug discovery?
I think it's not going to be as far different. I do think that there will certainly be ways that every generation of researchers and scientists will need to learn, right? New mechanisms of how they are gathering data, how they are holding on to the information, and how they are structuring that data. Generative AI models are only going to be as good as the data that they are trained on. I was on a panel a couple of months ago in Washington, D.C. at a medical summit, and it was a question that I received in the audience, which is very, very concerned about the bias. I said, inherently, we are the ones that are biased. It is not going to be the models that are biased. You have to make sure there are going to be consistencies, not just on the data of what they're being trained on, but consistency on the standardization of protocols and data format. And I think, again, this is not a generative AI comment. I think that's what we all are focused on in terms of if you're sitting there having wet lab and in silico work have some sort of consistency or interoperability around data formats it's always been a big focus.
Let's come back to the topic of human in the loop. What Shweta described is that the bias is the fault of the human in the loop. So shouldn't we rely on AI to correct this bias?
We as humans are going to be the only ones that are going to train these models. We're training these models by providing these data sets. And so the human, of course, has to be in the loop because it's also our job to ensure that these models are not biased, right? Because it's also our responsibility to put in the right data and least biased data, but then also make sure that we're also the human in the loop is because we also are responsible to understand the output. Next is a black box problem. Understanding the most complex AI models can be black boxes. And so it is important that at this stage, no one should blindly accept AI predictions. And we have to understand that it is actually a very iterative process, right? Experimental validation and reproducibility is key. So we have to make sure that we are aware of confirmation bias, right? The tendency that we're looking at information.
So there's a bottleneck then in the clinical trial stage of getting enough patients for the clinical trial, getting enough data and the right kind of data and getting the trial set up. I mean, the sad truth is that there are more clinical trials in play at the moment than there are patients to actually go into them. So what are the opportunities for artificial intelligence in accelerating and improving clinical trial capabilities and processes for the industry? And what does that mean from a regulatory point of view?
I am seeing pharmaceutical organizations leverage AI and generative AI particularly on three distinct areas. One, it is the design of the trial. Two, it's the actual deployment and recruitment. And the third is the analysis. Historically, many can copy and paste from a very similar clinical trial, then they have to make some changes. Some of these changes may not be complete, and some goes out with one wrong errors. Criteria includes patients 45 to 65 years of age. No, actually, it was supposed to be 45 to 55. Now you've got to pull all of these back. And there's some pretty significant analysis and numbers that are associated with everyday loss for when you have to retract the document. And so we're seeing the use of AI in not only generating the first draft of these documents and showing that there's statistically significant reduction in what I would call copy and paste error, but there's also this idea of, well, can you truly identify who are going to be the right areas or the right sites to have the highest rate of return. Sacramento particularly has a high volume of Cambodian-speaking individuals who then generally have a high propensity for XYZ disease. You're able to now layer this with so much more information. And so using that to actually optimize your recruitment rates. On the analysis and the data management side, it is a lot around looking at now identifying trends. First, automating some of the data entry that needs to happen, but then identifying some patterns and trends using generative AI. I still am always going to reiterate that it has to be step by step. We're not going to go from 0 to 100 overnight.
We're on the precipice of seeing that some entrenched ways of doing business in healthcare are changing. That's exciting.
So how does that feel for someone like Shweta to see all of this happening, considering the change that she's already witnessed throughout her career?
I feel that every experience I've had has now suddenly made sense and made it that this is why I am here at this crossroads of health and technology. There's also the sense of empowerment that I have a chance to contribute to something that's going to be meaningful and impactful. And that by the time my kids are grown, this is going to be how you're going to get your information or how you participate in a trial or what have you. I also want to be very realistic that, again, it's not about the technology. It's also like I see how my parents interact with the technologies, right? And even like the most simple things. And so while I feel very proud that technology can do this, I also feel the reality of like, we have to not only just challenge the status quo, but also bring everyone along. I think one of the most important career advice I had received early in my career is not just getting from point A to point B, but it's how you bring everybody along. It's going to be slow, but I think it's so exciting.
So, to better understand artificial intelligence transformative potential, practical barriers, and the importance of integrating it into how we work and the lessons that we've learned from its failures and successes, we have the expertise of Martin Stumpe, the Chief Data and Artificial Intelligence Officer at Danaher.
Danaher is our parent company, and they hosted their third annual Danaher Summit at the end of 2024 with a focus this year on AI in research and development.
AI really has transformative potential to enable solve a lot of problem classes. And with that, I mean really transformative technologies that solve something like information access or navigation or communication. So things where you initially were concerned about leaving your house and maybe getting lost in the middle of nowhere, and that's not even a concern anymore. And I think with AI, we'll actually have in a few years, if we do this right, have a lot of these examples where we say AI solved a problem that we don't even have to think about anymore, including in biomedicine and healthcare.
But as Shweta said, there are key barriers to the impact of AI.
And like any industry in its infancy, one of those barriers includes the lack of talent. Guess what? Training is required. But also, then there's entrenched issues, such as the output quality of the models that are used and unexpected challenges like data being ready to be used in these kinds of contexts, or the integration readiness, where success is about closing the loop between the physical and the digital worlds, ensuring that there's what people call bi-directional integration between the two.
Which is maybe what the rest of us call just a little back and forth, just making sure the right hand knows what the left hand is doing.
That is probably right, isn't it? It's just back and forth. We have these big fancy words, bi-directional integration, and
Quite.
It just means back and forth, a conversation.
Right. A conversation. Martin worked previously with Google. And so this is where some of his experience and his stories are coming from. He was working on different projects related to integrating AI into research and development.
An example I want to show here is also from about 8 years ago. This was work that we did at Google for building a machine learning model for diagnosing diabetic retinopathy, which is one of the
bleeding causes for reversible causes for blindness, and a complication of diabetes. This was the first AI paper in JAMA back in 2016. And what the model is doing was basically a relatively simple 5-grade classification of a fundus image of a patient into one of those 5 grades. And the model architecture here was pretty simple. It was ResNet architecture back then. Convolutional neural networks became mainstream. And the main challenge of this work was not in the machine learning. It was actually in the labels. So we collected more than 1 million labeled fundus images of an army of ophthalmologists and hundreds of thousands of actual fundus images. And the main challenge here was the quality of the labels because of low accuracy in medical diagnosis. And across the whole study we did, we found that there's a very low 65% integrator consistency, and also the integrator consistency. So if you ask the same ophthalmologist a couple of months afterwards, they even had different grades. The main point here is with these quantitative approaches to your data collection strategy, you can actually optimize for how do you balance data quantity versus quality versus multimodality to optimize the performance of the machine learning model you're trying to build.
So in the rapidly evolving artificial intelligence landscape, the true differentiator between success and a company that's struggling is going to lie in how it masters the process of connecting the physical and the digital world so that they can share data in both directions.
You need to get the right data out of the physical world with sensors, with manual data entry, in particular in clinical medicine, which is messy, and other things to get the right data into AI. And then you also need to get the output of the machine learning models back into the real world, which have actions, whether that's robotic lab workflows or AI-augmented clinical data entry systems or something. And there's a lot of change management. Getting this feedback cycle right, I think, is really differentiating real companies from bad ones, and that's the stuff we are focusing on.
In this episode of Discovery Matters, we explored the intersection of healthcare and technology, focusing on the transformative role of artificial intelligence and generative AI in life sciences. Shweta Maniar from Google Cloud reflected on her journey to enhance healthcare delivery, accelerate drug discovery, and support clinical trials. She highlighted AI's potential in optimizing processes such as analyzing data for target identification, improving clinical trial design, and fostering trust through human-in-the-loop systems.
And the conversation underscored the real need in the industry for thoughtful integration of artificial intelligence into the healthcare ecosystem, emphasizing that collaboration amongst regulators and scientists and technologists is absolutely fundamental. And the concluding insights from Martin Stumpe highlighted the successes in bridging the physical and digital worlds using artificial intelligence. And he's illustrated those by the efforts of, for example, diagnosing diabetic retinopathy. Together, the discussion paints, I think, a really hopeful and realistic picture of the fairly short-term and huge impact that AI is going to have in reshaping innovation in healthcare.
Well, not surprising that we're going to be optimistic about this on Discovery Matters. I mean, Connor, you're pretty passionate about AI as a topic. You know a lot about it, and we've been starting to experiment with it here in our daily lives. You are optimistic about it, aren't you?
I am optimistic, but it is my job to be optimistic. If I wasn't optimistic, I don't think I'd be in the role that I'm in. I can only assume that the future is going to be a little bit better than yesterday. So I was struck at a comment by a colleague last week that today is the worst we're going to be, and I quite like that.
Oh, right.
That
sure.
We need to think on, the way that we bring these tools to bear on the work that we're doing is just going to drive us to get better.
Speaking of getting better,
Indeed.
Every day is a school day.
So, Dodie, every day is a school day. What have you learned this week that's blown your mind?
Well, I went to one of my favorite sites to find, learn something quickly or find something out of the ordinary, sciencedaily.com. And this is a study from Brigham and Women's Hospital published in February of this year, finding a common brain circuit for something that is, I'm going to say, uniquely human, considering our topic today about artificial intelligence. These researchers found a common brain circuit for creativity.
So what, like your brain actually does a certain thing which makes you creative, or if you don't have these circuits, you're not creative?
Well, there are some circuits when active that make you more creative. So there's not a particular zone in the brain that makes you creative. It's connectivity. And interestingly, in one part of the study, they found that when somebody is being creative, so when they're writing creatively, making music or drawing, let's say dancing. I'm going to add that because I think dancing is being creative. Mm-hmm. But they found that when they were engaging in a creative activity, there was a part of the brain that also shut down. So the brain is prioritizing, saying, we're going to be creative over here. There's lots and lots of activity. And we're going to shut down the part of the brain that sets rules, which I think is good fun.
There's a part of the brain that sets rules. I turn that part of the brain off every Friday. Sometimes I forget to turn it on Monday.
There's real value here, and that is that these researchers found that people with brain injuries or neurodegenerative diseases, they may have increased creativity depending on their injury, or they may have decreased creativity depending on their injury. So it's an important discovery about the brain activity and how creativity shows up on an MRI.
That is absolutely fascinating. And so this is a research paper that's been published recently, or?
Correct. Published by Brigham and Women's Hospital. We'll put this in the show notes.
We will put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
And all the great things that we learn on this podcast go in the show notes. I learned something this week which rather blew my mind. This is what I learned this week. Something that's not necessarily new, but is perhaps surprisingly old. Aristotle, believe it or not, his most frequently described marine organism after the octopus, which was one of our favorite organisms on this podcast.
Cephalopods, that's right.
Exactly, was a scallop. And it held immense economic and cultural value on the Greek island of Lesbos. It was prized for its tender adductor muscles and its mother-of-pearl shells, and scallops supported a specialized fishery documented as early as 600 years before the Common Era. And Aristotle made detailed notes on this fishery and is one of the earliest classic cases of overexploitation of a natural resource by humans. There was a technological escalation where fishermen shifted from hand collecting in the shallows to using dredges, rakes with net bags dragged across the seabeds, and this technology increased yields but destroyed the scallop habitats that captured the juveniles indiscriminately. There was some environmental synergy with changes happening elsewhere, so there were droughts, possibly linked to the Mediterranean's arid phase, and that increased lagoon salinity, which stressed the scallop populations. And then something known as trophic cascades declined in the scallop populations. Filter feeders were then critical to water clarity. The water was no longer clear. It led to algal blooms and hypoxia, exacerbating fish kills, and lo, the death of the fishery. And this is over 2,000 years ago, and we still haven't learned. And I'll leave you with this quote from Aristotle. Where once the seabed glittered with their scallops' valves, now only barren sands remain, save for the occasional aged specimen. So I feel a bit like an aged specimen.
What happened to your optimism,
I
Connor?
know.
What happened
I'm not feeling
to your
particularly
optimism?
optimistic. We have been aware of human-driven
like
climate
cod.
change and environmental impact, for over 2,000 years. and we're still struggling to do the right thing about it.
All right. Well, whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, if you want to get in touch with us, we have our very own email now, and it is discovery.matters@scitiva.com. Do send us fan mail, please. Our producer is Beth Armit Brewster, editing, mixing, and supervision by the marvelous Tom Henley. My name is Dodie Axelson.
And my name is Conor McKechnie. Make sure you rate us on Spotify or whichever platform you use to listen to our podcast. We'll see you when we come back with another episode of Discovery Matters.
Bye for now.